So this is the technique for this next section. This is called the molten metal technique, but before we get into it, one thing I forgot to mention with the glitter poinsettia is if you want, you can just use colored cardstock, put your paste on, put the glitter on, and leave it as is. You don't necessarily need to color it. So this is a card here where it's just the white paste that has the glitter over top of it, just adding some sparkle to the snowflakes. Very, very simple card. You would want to use a bit of a color so that those snowflakes show through, but just so you know, you don't have to necessarily color it every time. You could just leave it white as is. So now let's get to this technique here. So this particular one here, we're not using glitter, we're using some embossing powders. So I've got some gold, I've got silver, and I've got a bronze one that I have had for years and years and years and years. So I'm going to tape my paper down. I'm going to take my stencil down, and I am just reusing some of the tapes from before, because if you can reuse it, why not? The other thing I'm going to need is a heat gun to melt that powder. And I'm using a little Slurpee straw in order to be able to control where my powder is going. So I'm going to take some paste here. Now you'll notice here I've got jagged edges. I didn't want to have the whole thing covered completely, as well as the fact that these particular stencils I'm using, they're meant for tags, so they're a little bit narrower than a card front, but I thought this would add a little bit more interest to it anyways. Let's get that out of the way. So once again, I'm pushing down, so I'm pushing the paste into that stencil, and I don't need to worry about any that falls on my mat. It just washes up super easy with a wet cloth. I have some baby wipes that I just have in my craft room for easy washing. Once I've got it through everywhere I want it, I'm going to remove some of the excess so that I see the image from the stencil. Close my paste. Lift it up just like a door so that if it falls in the same spot. Remove my tape, stick it in my water. All right, now this piece here, I'm going to take the tape off because I don't need that anymore. I'm going to quickly wipe that paste off so that I've got a clean surface here to work on. Comes off as easy as that. There we go. I'm going to work on a scrap piece of paper, and I'm going to open my powders here. And it doesn't matter which one you start with. I'm just taking my Slurpee straw and tapping it to release some of the powder onto my tape or my paste here. Now, obviously, because I'm using a mix of powders, I can't put these back into their container. So I have a container here that I just have mixed metal embossing powder labeled to the top so that I know it's just a mix of a bunch of different colors. Could possibly use that on a future project if there was like something with gears or whatever. I think it would be kind of cool to have the mixed metal powder on that. I'm gonna add a little bit more gold up here. So I'm also kind of trying not to use too much powder, because like most of the time if I'm using one color powder, I'm just dumping the whole thing, tapping the excess off and then putting it right back in the container. For this one, I can't do that because the excess is going to be all mixed powders and I don't want to waste it. So I'm going to tap my fingers on the bottom to kind of help those powders move around. I want to make sure that every part that has paste is covered with the powder, and I see there's an empty spot right there, so I'm going to put the powder right on top of there. Doesn't matter that it's mixed there, and I'm just going to, there we go, now we got that paste covered. This here, I can just use my finger to wipe the excess off, and I can take a little brush for the sections that are a little bit too close that I don't want to accidentally ruin with my finger. Tap all the excess off. Now, normally you would wait for that to dry completely and then you would melt it with your embossing gun. Because this one is called the molten metal technique, we're going to do it while it is still wet. And what it's going to end up doing, it's going to puff some of the paste, and it just creates some really cool texture in there. So before I do that, I'm going to make sure these are completely closed, because I am the type that would knock it out and spill it. And let's melt the powder. You'll see the powder is just a dull finish, and as it dries or as it heats, it'll become glossy and shiny. You see how that powder just puffed the texture paste up? Some of those will stay raised, some of them won't, but that's what makes it partly, that's what makes it more interesting to me. All right, so once it is all melted, now I do need to set that aside to dry. I don't want to glue that to the front of a card because I can't press anything down because the paste underneath there is still wet. So I do need to let that dry completely. Once it's dried, I'm going to glue it to the front of my card and then just add a sentiment. So I'm not going to actually assemble the cards in this class because the assembly for all of them is very, very simple. I simply glue it to the front and then just add a little sentiment. I try to keep the texture paste technique image the focal point of each of the cards. I will have on the supply list what the stamp sets are that I've used for each one for their sentiment so that you will have that information. But there we go. Isn't that cool? And I love how some of them stay puffed and some of them don't. It just makes it so much more interesting visually to look at. We'll see you for the next technique.